In this lesson, we are going to talk about unit testing your application layer, and you will see that these unit tests are somewhat different from domain layer unit tests. In other words, the focus is different. Now, what you should be testing in the application layer are your use cases. So for example, here I have the cancel booking use case, the complete booking use case, and so on. The one that I will focus on for this demonstration is the reserve booking use case, and we're going to be testing the reserve booking command handler. So let me walk you through what we have inside, and this is going to make writing our unit test somewhat easier. The reserve booking command handler handles the reserve booking command. You probably already knew this, but it's worth repeating. If I head over to the reserve booking command, it contains a few properties that are required to complete the reserve booking use case. This is the apartment ID, the user identifier, the start and the end date of this booking. The reserve booking command handler also has a couple of dependencies. It needs the user repository, the apartment repository, the booking repository, the unit of work, the pricing service, and the datetime provider. All of these dependencies are injected through the constructor, which is going to make our life so much easier when it comes to writing unit tests. And you will be able to see the real value of dependency injection because this allows us to provide our custom implementations of the dependent services. For example, I can provide a user repository implementation that I can configure with some specific behavior. What we are actually going to do is provide mocked instances of our services, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're going to talk about that a bit later. Let's move over to the handle method and see what we have inside. So this method accepts a command instance, and then is going to use this command to perform the actual use case. Inside of the handle method, we're going to fetch the user based on the user ID. Then if the user is null, we're going to return a failure result with a respective error object. The same is going to happen with an apartment. We're going to check if it exists, and if not, we're going to return a failure result with an error. Then we are going to perform some validation on the apartment instance that we are trying to reserve to check if it's not already taken for the start and the end date. And of course, we are going to return a respective error object if this is the case. Otherwise, if we pass all of the preconditions, then we are going to call the booking reserve method, which we already unit tested in the previous lesson, and we're going to add this booking to the repository, save the changes using the unit of work, and return the booking identifier. I'm also wrapping this inside of a try-catch statement where we are handling the concurrency exception, in which case we return another failure result with an error object. And all of this behavior is an excellent candidate for writing unit tests for our application use cases. So let's go back to our unit test project. I set it up with XUnit and Fluent assertions, and I'm going to add a new folder inside that I will call bookings, and this folder will contain test classes for any use cases belonging to the booking. Let's create our first test case, which I will call the reserve booking tests. I'm going to make this class public, and then I'm going to spend a bit more time on my initial setup of my tests, and you will see how this is going to make writing my actual test cases much easier. What I mean by this is preparing any dependencies that I need for my tests ahead of time. For example, I'm going to create a static read-only field to represent the current time, and we're going to use this from our unit tests. Another thing that's going to be useful is having an instance of the reserve booking command that we can share across our unit tests. So let's go ahead and create that. Now, to be able to reference the reserve booking command, I'm going to need a reference to the application layer. So let's go ahead and add that. And once I add this, I can add a using statement, and I will be able to reference the reserve booking command. The next thing I want to add is a private read-only field that is going to contain the reserve booking command handler instance, which will be my system under test. So let's go ahead and add this field. And even though it's visible to my unit test project, you will see I'm encountering an error because this class is internal and it's not visible outside of the application assembly. Luckily, there is an elegant way to solve this. All you need to do is open up the project file of the application library and introduce the following configuration. What I'm doing here is decorating this project with the internals visible to attribute, and this is going to make any internal members in the application project visible to the assembly that I specified here. In this case, it's going to be the Bookify application unit tests assembly, which is our unit test project. If I go back to our test class, you can see that the reserve booking command handler is now visible, and we can continue with our test setup. The next thing I want to add are all of these dependencies that I have here. So I'm going to copy the private read-only fields and add them here, and I'm going to slightly update their names to make it explicit that these will be mocked services. So I'm going to use the user repository mocked, apartment repository mock, and so on. The pricing service, because it has no state, I'm just going to use the pricing service itself. And let's also use the datetime provider mock. If you aren't familiar with this concept, a mock is a fake implementation of your service that you can configure with some specific behavior, and there are some excellent testing libraries that you can use to create your mocks. I'm going to be using nsubstitute, so let's go ahead and look for this library. Let's install the nsubstitute NuGet package. I'm going to add the latest version, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to use it inside of my test case to set up my mocked services. Let's start with the user repository mock. How you create a mock with nsubstitute is by accessing the substitute class, and it has a few static methods that you can use. I like to use the generic for method, and I can just specify the user repository. nsubstitute uses a Fluent syntax, and it's pretty easy to work with, and you can see how this reads like a sentence. I like to interpret it like the user repository mock should have a value of a substitute for the iUser repository. And inside of our individual test cases, we are further going to configure our mocked services. Let's add the mocked values for the other services that we have. So I'm going to use some copy-paste programming, and then let's add the apartment repository mock. This will be a substitute for the apartment repository. Then let's do the booking repository and the respective substitute. Then I will do the unit of work mock and the unit of work substitute. I said that I will use the actual value for the pricing service. And then for the datetime provider mock, I'm going to generate my mocked instance. And I'm also going to configure my mocked service. And how you do this with nsubstitute is by simply accessing the method or the property that you want to configure. In this case, this will be the UTC Now property on the datetime provider interface. And I have access to the returns method, which allows me to configure what this mocked instance is going to return when the UTC Now property is accessed. And what I want to do is to return my static field that I defined at the beginning of my test class. And finally, we are ready to initialize the reserve booking command handler. So let's just call the constructor and pass in the dependencies one by one. So I'm going to pass in the booking repository, the unit of work. For the pricing service, I'm going to create a new instance, and then let's pass in the datetime provider mock. So this is our setup for the reserve booking command handler, and we are finally ready to start writing our unit tests. The first thing I want to test in the reserve booking command handler is this case here when the user repository returns null and I need to return a failure result from